and welcome back to 10 Things About Writing. And in this session, I'm going to talk about place. I'm in a different place today. I'm in one of my favourite places. And it's important, I think, for you to think of place as something more than just a decorative setting for your story. A lot of the time, place is inseparable from the story you're telling because we're all affected by our environments to a certain extent, even if your setting is a very familiar urban setting and you don't think about how it affects you at all. It will affect the way your characters act, the way your story unfolds. All kinds of things will factor into it. And in some cases, you can think of various books where, in fact, the setting is at least as important as any of the characters. Where would Wuthering Heights be without the Yorkshire Moors, which arguably is the principal character in the whole of that book? Where would Gormenghast be without its kind of fetid, intense environment? So place is at least as important as character, and you have to build it with the same amount of thought and mindfulness. Now, when you are world building, and it doesn't really mean building a world, obviously, it means bringing your audience into the world that you have chosen to portray. In some cases, it's this world, but this is an awfully big world, and you may have to properly delineate it and set out its rules and the things that your audience is supposed to notice, because they may not be familiar with your part of the world. I tend to write about Yorkshire. I also write about France. I'm aware that some members of my audience may not have set foot in either of those places. It's important for me to make those places as real to them as possible. Very often when you talk about world building, you're told to create a world that your reader would like to inhabit. This isn't always true, but it's a good rule of thumb. I mean, obviously, in some versions of dystopian futures, in some dystopian fantasies, the last thing you want is to inhabit those worlds. And yet, you may be interested in them and drawn into them anyway. Sometimes inhabiting a dystopian world is cathartic on some level. So it's not necessarily a world you want to live in, but it is a world that you want to believe in. And believing in your imaginary world is absolutely key to the development of your plot and also to the believability of your characters, because everybody is a product of their environment as well as their upbringing. We behave differently in different places. Chances are you behave differently when you're on holiday. I behave differently when I'm in France. I become a lot more French when I'm in France. I become slightly less French when I'm in England. You may develop different characteristics when you go abroad. You may be more adventurous when you go to a new place. You may be less adventurous. You may be affected by things like the light, the weather, the food, the language, the people. All of these things need to be built into whichever world you're portraying to properly convey the journey of your story. And one of the things I keep kicking on about is multi-sensory perception of your environment. And this, I think, is the key. You don't want to info-dump your world in the first third of your book. You want, much as you drip-feed characteristics from your protagonist, your main characters, into your story, you want to drip-feed awareness of your world. Nobody really wants to start off a book by looking at a lot of maps. I know some fantasy books do have a lot of maps. But does anybody really look at them before they've read the book? I'm not sure they do. Maybe they look at them afterwards when they've got interested in the world and they want to figure out where people went. But you should be able to do this without resorting to maps or lists of places, because we encounter different environments first of all, by first impressions. We notice different things, and so do your readers. They might notice the quality of light in a place. They might notice what the buildings are made of. They might notice the weather. The weather is a whole topic in itself, and it can sometimes really establish the feeling of a place. It's not just whether it's hot or cold, or whether there's snow on the ground, or whether there are fig trees growing, or whatever. It's not necessarily just that. It can be the light, it can be the atmosphere, it can be the humidity, it can be the fact that it rains at 6 o'clock every night. And of course, if you are writing about a real place, you are going to need to research these things fairly profoundly to make them real. I'll talk about research a little bit later, but ideally, if you are writing about a real place, it really does help to have experienced that place. The world is full of otherwise perfectly decent books written and set in places like London or New York, where it's very clear that the writer has never actually been there. Or if they have, it was maybe for a weekend and they didn't properly take in anything more than a kind of tourist vibe, which can be enough but most often isn't if you're choosing to depict a place in a really forensic way and properly get to the heart of how it feels to be there. If you can't go to a place, there are other ways of researching. Reading is always a really good way, but there is nothing like actually going to a place and staying there for long enough to take in what it feels like to be there, what it smells like. What does New York smell like? It smells of fried food and those sweet pastries and bagels and pretzels that vendors sell on the streets all the time. It smells of pollution. In summer, it smells very strongly of litter and bins. There is a very particular smell to New York. There's a very particular smell to London, which doesn't have that sweet smell of pretzels and fried food, but it does have the grimness and the soot and the smog and that kind of powdery smell of dry pavements, or that dank smell of wet pavements. Paris has a slightly different smell also. Different cities have different smells. Obviously, different countries have different smells, different seasons have different smells. And so the thing I'd like you to do today, in your 15 minutes of writing exercise, is to go and position yourself somewhere, preferably outside, but it doesn't have to be. And I would like you to write about your environment. It doesn't have to be a set piece, it doesn't have to be a story. I would like you to write about what you can see, what you can hear, what the weather is like, what the atmosphere is like, what it feels like to be in the place you have chosen. And I want you to try to think of this in using all your senses. So, colours, textures, light, sound, scent. We generally have 5 senses to use. Most writers don't use them all. This is a bit of a waste. If you want to create a fully immersive experience for your readers, it's a good idea to remember that you have more than just the visual to work with. And the more senses you bring into your narrative, the more your readers will be drawn into the narrative. And the more you will be able to talk about how your characters are defined by their environment and how it affects the plot. So try to do that for 15 minutes. I'll be back tomorrow talking about something else, and till then, have a good day. I'll see you tomorrow.